Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
Parents must be careful about sending their children to a language school too early. According to some studies, learning a foreign language may have some bad effects on children if they start too soon. Above all, children may get to hate a foreign language if they attend classes from early on. That can make them lazy with language studies later on. In addition, some children can be very confused when they learn a foreign language and their mother tongue at the same time. In case they are not ready, early language learning will only slow down children's learning. I believe that parents should consider the dangers of children studying a foreign language too young.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
I'm sure you have all used cyber encyclopedias rather frequently. Well, today I'll mention a few negative points about these resources. For one thing, cyber encyclopedias are not reliable, as anyone can update their articles. The new information may contain errors, and articles on complex topics may not be totally correct. Paper encyclopedias, on the other hand, are carefully edited by scholars and experts, which makes them authentic. Another thing is that cyber articles can be biased. It's because the contributors come from the younger generations who usually prefer pop culture topics to academic ones. Thus, cyber encyclopedias may not have a full selection of topics. Lastly, cyber encyclopedias can be fun to read, but they are often too basic for real academic research. The articles provide convenient web links, but they often lack depth and detail. In short, clicking around the net is no substitute for thorough library research.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes. Good morning, class. In today's lecture, I'm going to give you some arguments against medical uses of stem cells. The first is that these treatments may not work medically. According to a U.S. study, about 20% of mice treated with stem cells for Parkinson's disease died from brain tumors. Even in the United Kingdom, where diabetes stem cell research is very advanced, scientists say they are far from finding any cures. There are also ethical problems with using stem cells. To obtain stem cells, it is necessary to grow and destroy human embryos in the harvesting procedure. It means that a human's life must be ended at its early stage. Furthermore, stem cell technology would make it inevitable to grow and then kill more new embryos to supply cell banks. Finally, stem cell therapy could be more expensive than ordinary drug treatment. It's because the biotechnology industry will need to recover the billions of dollars it has already invested in stem cell research. So the vast majority of citizens might not be able to benefit from stem cell therapy. Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes. People say that milk is hugely beneficial for us as far as it is consumed as part of a balanced diet. But we should be aware of some negative side effects of milk intake. First, milk consumption may cause calcium loss. When we have difficulty digesting milk, our body draws calcium out of the bones to neutralize the acid in the stomach. Therefore, milk intake may contribute to developing osteoporosis instead of preventing it. In addition, milk protein is a common cause of food allergies. A milk allergy occurs when our immune system reacts against the protein contained in milk. Finally, milk is fattening. According to recent studies, children who drank more than 3 servings of milk per day gained considerable weight, whether they drank whole or skim milk. So be careful not to take more than the recommended amount on a daily basis. Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
Good morning, class. You've all read about the potential nutrition and environmental benefits associated with genetically modified, GM for short, foods. Well, today I'm going to talk about some of the harmful effects of GM foods. To start with, GM foods, often nicknamed Frankenfoods, could put humans at risk for deadly food allergies. For example, Brazil nut genes, which can cause fatal allergic reactions in some people, were discovered in one U.S. company's genetically modified soybeans. Fortunately, the product was quickly withdrawn from the market. In addition, growing GM foods may harm the environment by killing helpful insects. In one study, Cornell University researchers found that monarch butterflies died after eating leaves containing Bt bacteria, a natural insect poison inserted into GM crops. Finally, GM foods could give a few huge agribusiness companies a dangerous monopoly on global food production. In 2006, the top 3 seed companies, Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta, controlled 44% of the global market. All of these companies are active in GM technology, and in the future their policies could affect the world's food supply.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
Whenever we look into a crucial issue, we must never forget to study it thoroughly before coming to any conclusions. But the benefits of nuclear energy is one area where people often fail to apply this principle. If you think nuclear energy is a cheaper source of energy, you are only looking at one side of the coin. Once a nuclear power plant is constructed, it will generate energy that is more cost-effective than fossil fuels. But it must be noted that constructing a nuclear power plant calls for astronomical costs. And, as a matter of fact, over the last 2 decades, the cost of building a new nuclear power plant rose over 3-fold. On top of this huge expense, the existing electric power plants and other energy generators will either be replaced or reduced in productivity, which means wasting people's tax dollars. Also, we cannot leave out potential health hazards to workers when construction of nuclear power plants becomes the center of the controversy. It is an undeniable fact that any worker on the premises of a plant will be exposed to dangerous radiation. Although some say it is a minimal amount, the important point is that they are still exposed to it almost daily. And we may be led to think that there have been no cases of serious illness involving workers associated with exposure to radiation. But have you ever thought that this may be because these occupational illnesses take a long time to manifest themselves? In light of these facts, we must be more cautious before we begin to resort to nuclear energy as our principal energy source.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
If we look at the grimmer side of a partnership, we cannot leave out personal liability. In a partnership, you run the risk of losing what you have invested as a partner of a business entity. However, you and your partners are also legally liable for the expenses incurred by the business. So what does all this mean? Well, the more money you put in, the more money you can lose. And you know what else? You and your partner had better execute a written agreement clearly dividing up the profit as well as the losses, just in case something goes wrong. After all, it's a fact that many people engaged in partnerships worry about death, retirement, or even deception by their partners. On top of this concern, there is the impediment of personal feelings in business. Sure, you may be attracted by the fact that partnerships are usually launched by business partners who are intimately close, or who go together like needle and thread. But this is what brings partnerships down. Personal relationships cannot interfere with important business decisions. Once they do, there can be no impartial or fair decision. What's worse, since each partner has some stake in the business, there is no real hierarchy. And absence of hierarchy can lead to personal disputes which only cripple the management of an organization.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
Okay, many people say that education does not discriminate according to age, and with the inception of the new distance learning program, Education also does not seem to discriminate according to location, which is the reason that distance learning has been hailed as an excellent way to elevate people's minds and abilities. In the midst of all the hype, people seem to overlook some of the disadvantages posed by distance learning. First of all, distance learning places significant burdens on professors since the classes are designed to accommodate the students' need more than the professors. Students can utilize distance learning programs well since they can start the course whenever they'd like and even finish the assignment at their most convenient time. But this means professors must grade exams and evaluate students irregularly throughout the year because they do not know when students will sign up for the courses or when they will complete their assignments. Due to its secluded setting, distance learning is highly popular with students who are reluctant to study in a classroom atmosphere. The only problem is that it is too secluded. Although some students may prefer to study by themselves, many times they will require personal attention from their professors, especially when they are faced with a difficulty. Unfortunately, this is quite lacking in distance learning programs. And the greatest attraction of distance learning probably comes from its easy accessibility. But because it is possible for people to take the courses almost anywhere with an internet connection, online courses are attached with a stigma. People generally tend to think that online courses are not as rigorous as offline courses, and online students do not experience the traditional college experience. Hence, they believe offline courses are superior to online ones.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
A lot of people think about self-employment in a romantic sort of way. Sure, it's great if you break through and succeed, but the sad fact is that more than 50% of small businesses fail within the first year. 95% fail within 5 years, and the majority of the surviving businesses yield only a modest income. In other words, it's a long shot. Most entrepreneurs don't strike it rich and retire to the Bahamas. In fact, those who work for someone else generally earn more and enjoy better benefits and job security than self-employed entrepreneurs. Now, it is true that some people are glad to trade all that for being their own boss. However, they face a rough road full of uncertainties, burdensome responsibilities, and tough decisions. They may have thought that being self-employed meant freedom and self-determination. But the fact is that the boss is the one who answers to the customer. If there is a problem or some kind of mistake, the boss has to take the blame and sometimes pay out of his own pocket. The boss often has to put in long hours and make countless sacrifices in his personal life to keep his dream alive. Then there's the myth of the untold riches to be had when you don't work for someone else. Again, some entrepreneurs do establish very successful ventures, but the majority find that those untold riches are, well, just not there. Often they have to bear the financial burden of running a business because many banks are reluctant to back an unproven startup. Many new businesses fail because the owners underestimate how much capital it takes to keep them afloat. Overall, self-employment means a lot of financial obligations with few or none of the benefits of working for someone else, such as health insurance, sick pay, paid vacation, pension, and so on. When you take a good look at all the risks and responsibilities, starting up a business is not all that different from investing your life savings in lottery tickets. Daring? Sure. Smart? Well, you're only a genius if you win.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
Science is constantly changing, not the methods, but the results. Take, for example, the question of nature versus nurture. For a long time, people felt children's environments were the biggest factors in the development of their characteristics. But new research is proving this to be wrong. There is the idea that children become like their parents because of the parents' influence. Doctors set a good example and then push their children to succeed. However, what happens if you take a highly intelligent man and woman's child and give it to people with normal levels of intelligence? Well, Even if the new adoptive parents have almost no education, the child will usually go on to a successful career. There might not be even one book in the house, but that kid will find a way to learn in spite of his environment. Mental illness is also more closely related to genetics than previously believed. An example of this close connection can be seen in the case of the Thompson twins. These two boys were adopted by separate families soon after their births, and never saw each other until they were adults. However, both developed a rare phobia as teenagers. Although one was raised by a wealthy family in Scotland, and the other by a middle-class family in America, at the age of about 13, both became unexplainably afraid of water. A further connection was that both were cured of their fear, although using different methods. It would seem that a person's personality develops in certain ways, regardless of surroundings.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Listen to a lecture on the topic you just read about and take notes.
There continues to be a lot of people who place too much importance on the connection between words and ideas. Specifically, they believe that there is a close relationship between language and culture. Here, when I say culture, I mean the ways that people in a certain area see and understand the world. In reality, there is very little that can be learned about a culture through its main language, and there is very little that one's language does in terms of affecting how and what one thinks. The most often cited proof for a connection is the number of ways the Inuit can describe snow. In fact, any language can describe different kinds of snow, but a certain culture may not have many specific words for snow because combinations of words work just as well. One word or 10 words are going to be just as effective in terms of creating a verbal description of the world. In addition, American Hopi tribe may not use tenses in their sentences, not because time is insignificant, but because they do not think in terms of words at all. In fact, when people see an event, they think in pictures. It's easy to see why this is. If you had to think in terms of words, you'd be too slow to get anything done. A priceless piece of art is about to fall off a table. Do you think, if it hits the ground, it's going to break, so I should grab it? No, instead, you see a picture in your head much faster, and you grab it. Likewise, when people say language constrains the paraha from viewing the world, they are making a very simplistic and careless association. It may be true to a certain degree that the absence of most numbers in their language prevents them from learning how to calculate. However, it's the social structure and culture that shape how they see the world, not language. The Piraha live in a small, closely knit society where complex economic structures or social systems are unnecessary. If you live in such a society, you will easily understand why the numbers 3 or 4 or 100 are not needed.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
The Energy Policy Act of 2005 was received with skepticism by many Americans, raising one very important question. Was daylight savings really an environmental concern, or was it actually more about the economy? You see, an extra hour of daylight for 4 or 5 weeks each year directly translates into a lot of extra shopping hours. This explains why the main proponents of the extension were corporations, not environmentalists. Are Americans more likely to leave their lights off and avoid watching TV with more daylight hours? Yes, but what are they doing instead? Well, they're getting into their fuel-powered cars and driving to places like shopping malls and golf courses. In other words, they're spending money as well as energy. So, do you think extending daylight savings time is good in many different ways? Not really. Daylight savings in general can actually entail unintended and negative consequences. Studies prove that productivity on the job is reduced for up to a week after each time change. Traffic accidents also increase due to sleep deprivation and jet lag. Speaking of flying, can anyone guess why airlines were the first to protest the expansion of DST? Well, with so many people traveling over Thanksgiving, they knew that economic loss would be inevitable from changed flight schedules? What happens when confused travelers miss their flights? Airplanes fly with empty seats.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about. If you have done the reading assignment, you might be led to think that telecommuting, or the virtual office as some other people call it, serves its purpose well. But telecommuting is not entirely free from drawbacks. With careful observation, opponents of telecommuting, or the virtual office, argue that although telecommuting opens more doors for the disadvantaged workforce, employees who work from their homes are subject to less job benefits than office workers. For one thing, due to their isolation from the rest of the workers, they are not often considered for promotion and other career advancements. For the same reason, virtual office workers cannot exert much influence on the organization. Therefore, they are usually the first to be laid off when a company downsizes. Now, in the employer's interest, telecommuting is not very satisfactory in its efficiency. It may be true that employers can hire the cheapest and most productive employees from around the world, but greater costs can be incurred. For telecommuting to be possible, an employee's home has to be equipped with the necessary telecommunications infrastructure, such as the internet and phone lines. And not every employee, especially those living in remote places and developing countries, will have such access. Therefore, the cost of installment will eventually come from the employer's pockets.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
It's not always an easy decision for companies when it comes to filling managerial spots. When thinking about the years of dedication poured in by current members of the organization, current officers may deserve the opportunity. On the other hand, when considering fresh outside expertise, hiring capable professionals from outside is very compelling. But after weighing the benefits of both options, you will notice that the advantages of scouting outside talent are not conclusive. For sure, it is unquestionable that seniority alone cannot be the sole criterion for filling an important managerial position. However, we can argue that filling in those spots with someone from another company just because they will boldly propose creative ideas is not fair. The truth is that existing employees with a handful of experience in the industry have a lot of fresh, innovative ideas to suggest. Usually, the problem does not lie with the employees, but it mostly lies with the organizations. Too many companies fail to provide either the atmosphere or the system that encourages their workers, especially those in lower management and beneath, to speak their minds freely. Without rectifying the problem within their own organizations first, companies will never collect any new ideas from their employees, whether they're from inside or outside. On similar grounds, thoughtlessly scouting outside talent after concluding that employees only sit around waiting to be promoted without making any contribution has two serious flaws. First, companies do not only look at seniority when moving employees up the ranks. There are obviously other factors that companies include in their evaluations, such as performance, leadership, work attitude, and assessments by colleagues. Second, companies cannot rely on outside help all the time whenever they are in need of a breakthrough. Instead, they must create their own internal source for new ideas that will entice the market. Not utilizing the pool of talent they already have will be a detrimental waste to the organization.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Over the last decade, international adoption has increased over twofold. Also known as inter-country adoption, international adoption is available in over 50 countries around the world. And this wide availability is one reason that people turn their eyes to foreign countries to foster a child. But it is rash for people to adopt a child from another country without careful deliberation because international adoption does not always serve the best interest of the adoptive families and the adopted children. Despite their good intentions, international adoption may not always be the best choice for the adoptive parents. Although there are many kids desperately in need of a caring home, if families are looking for a newborn infant, it will not be possible through international adoption. In fact, children that they bring home will be at least 6 months of age. Now, people also opt for international adoption because they won't have to worry about possible custody battles or other interference from the natural parents. But people must understand that most adoption agencies have little background information on the kids or their natural parents, such as medical history and family environment. Therefore, people have no way of tracing the history of their adopted children, which can be very useful information. As for the children with their new foreign parents, inter-country adoption can be a turning point for the worse. It is true that most countries that are notoriously known for exporting children are less developed. But it is dangerous and biased to assume that orphans in these countries will live abject lives without any future. In fact, many of these countries, such as China and India, are exploding economies with growing opportunities and development. Another dangerous assumption is that adoptive parents are qualified caregivers with stable homes. I don't want to say they are not eligible to adopt, but there are some who jump in without knowing the possible hardships. And it is impossible to judge whether people will be able to handle them after simple interviews and a few documents. Even if only a few kids are adopted into the wrong homes, international adoption should be deliberated upon.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
So the internet has opened up yet another way to approach recruiters. Or I should say another way to advertise yourself to them online. Now then, we should all be asking ourselves, how practical would it be to post my resume on job wanted ads online? Well, let's take a look. Too many job applicants think that uploading their resumes and other information about themselves will draw in thousands of employers who peruse everything they post. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. It doesn't matter if the visitors at online job-wanted sites amount to hundreds of thousands a day. What really counts is exactly how many of those visitors are serious recruiters. And even if they are recruiters, just how many of them are the recruiters in the industry you want to work in. To give you an example, it has been reported that recruiters from the companies with over 10,000 employees never hire from job-wanted sites because they already have piles of resumes that are sent into the company daily. The goal of online job-wanted sites is simple. Instead of going to recruiters, make them come to you by decorating your personal web space with eye-catching information. But only if it were that simple. You see, when employers look for someone to fill a position in their organization, they want a dedicated individual who has deliberately researched about the company he wants to work for. Also, employers are not going to take the trouble of peering into every link and downloading every attachment just to find out your capabilities. Most of these people neither have the time nor the patience to do it. In the end, a major flaw of online job search sites is probably that they are too employee-oriented. These sites boast of employing the synergy of employees' talents and the site's technical expertise. But how about the synergy between the sites and the employers? After all, aren't they the ultimate decision makers? To locate the right worker for the job, recruiters must painstakingly go through a long list of names and floods of data. Recruiters also say that many of these sites lose credibility because they are not focused on a specific industry, but a whole range of them. If job seekers and job-seeking sites really want to enjoy this synergy effect, they'd better start considering the needs of the employers more seriously.
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Despite what the proponents say the benefits of ecotourism are, governments must take caution in pursuing multi-million-dollar projects to bring in tourists. Now, I say this because these benefits are not what they appear to be. Rather, they can entail huge cost, both for the local people and the environment. First of all, tourism and preservation are like water and oil. In other words, any ecosystem becomes tainted once humans set their foot in it, no matter how careful they are. Ecotourism is a word that makes people blind to this inevitable truth by stressing only the eco-friendly aspects of it. People must be aware that ecotourism is still a type of tourism where travelers leave regular traces, disturbing plants and animals in their natural habitat. Consequently, ecotourism comes at the expense of the environment, and people must be kept off limits if the environment is to be truly preserved and protected. Some governments also prematurely conclude that ecotourism will be a major source of revenue for local firms, but it is usually the giant multinational corporations that secure most of the profit. The scale of the projects for constructing necessary infrastructure and accommodation is just too big for local companies to undertake. As a result, the real money-making multi-million-dollar projects will be handled by global conglomerates, while the local firms will be regulated to doing support jobs. The problems of ecotourism would not be so bad if they only ended here. But unfortunately, they go far beyond. Supporters of ecotourism misled people by claiming that it creates jobs for local people, so they will not have to farm the land. But what they do not say is that the newly created jobs are labor-intensive work that only pays minimum wage, and they are taken on mostly by the local residents with little education. On the other hand, the high-paying jobs go to city-educated and foreign workers. When considering these facts, can we say that ecotourism truly benefits the local inhabitants?
Summarize the points you just heard in the lecture, explaining how they cast doubt on the points made in the reading.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about. I must say that I find speed cameras to be some of the most abhorrent devices that police departments all across the country are using. Not only do they infringe upon our basic rights, but they are also inherently dangerous. Here, let me give you a few reasons as to why I feel this way. First of all, speed cameras actually don't make the roads safer. They make them more dangerous in many cases. Why? Let me explain. People are often worried about getting a speeding ticket since they cost so much money. So if a person is speeding and suddenly notices a camera, what's he going to do? Slam on the brakes. That's what. And then the car behind him might just slam into him. There are numerous documented cases of accidents occurring because people tried suddenly to slow down upon seeing a traffic camera. So they aren't saving lives. In some cases, they are ending them. Here's another thing. Now that fewer police officers are being tasked to catching speeders, they have more time to snoop around and bother law-abiding citizens. Just the other week, I was harassed in the park by a cop when all I was doing was sitting on a park bench feeding the squirrels. And you'll notice that crime rates haven't decreased since these speed cameras have been installed. So, what are the cops doing with their extra time? Finally, cameras malfunction. Several people have received pictures in the mail that weren't even their cars, and others have gotten ticketed when they were definitely not speeding. Simply put, these cameras cannot be trusted to be completely accurate, and the government would be wise to ban their use before they cause any more problems.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Okay, today let's talk about the causes of crime in a community. Let us once again ask whether poverty, race, and the size and what makes up a population really cause crimes. First, does poverty really cause crime? No, it does not mean that a poor community has more cases of crime. Hundreds of studies show that crimes do not increase when a lot of people have no jobs. In the US, for example, when their economy was good and the employment level was good, the crime rate also rose. When their economy was down and unemployment was a problem, their crime rate also dropped. You see the point? Okay, let's move on to another cause of crime, race. They say that the blacks commit more crimes than the whites. Researches show that it's not race that is the problem here. More crimes are committed by the blacks not because of their color or their race. It's like this. There are more cases of crime in the black community because there are more cases of broken families there than in the white community. Now, the third reason, the size of the population and its composition. Do these really affect crime rate? The size of the population does not have any effect. With regard to the composition, it's like this. The structure of the families that makes up the society is the one that contributes to higher incidence of crime. More broken families equal a higher crime rate. Why? Because delinquents come from broken families. There's a lot of evidence that shows that criminal behavior of teenagers has its roots in their childhood, when they were not shown love and affection by their parents, or worse, abandoned by their parents. Their feeling of not being loved and cared for led to their being violent members of society.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Okay, let's take another look at the goal theory. It's actually a controversial concept in the area of education. Why? Because studies show that although internal motivation is more desirable, it is the external motivation that directly influences the student. Let's see. Here are some factors that contribute to the external motivation. Firstly, yes, it could be true that certain tasks do challenge you, and your ego and self-esteem can be raised by achieving these tasks. But in the real world, you're more likely to become motivated when you feel that people will praise and recognize you for it. For example, suppose you're in a science fair competition. You may get excited about the project, thinking you will be able to develop your talent and improve your skills. But actually, you're more motivated by the recognition you will get if you win the contest. In fact, research shows that a lot of students become discouraged at the possibility of failure because their motivation is dependent on the success of their work. Okay, what else? Well, they say students are motivated by the desire to master a task, but more likely, they are motivated by external signs of a good performance. Well, admit it. You guys study for your history exams because you want to get a high grade in the class, not because you want to master it, don't you? You say you may want to learn more about history, but actually what drives you to study are external things such as getting a high grade or having your name on the honor roll list. Finally, it is a proven fact that external concrete rewards, such as monetary prizes, are more effective in directly motivating a student. In fact, they even weaken whatever internal motivation a student has for the task. A reward-based system or a competition giving a student monetary incentive for winning decreases a student's internal motivation because he becomes dependent on the rewards in order to perform well. So once you remove the prize, the student loses the motivation to win.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you read about.
Today, we're going to talk about facial expressions. You know, smiles, grins, tears, things like that. Are they the same for everybody? The answer is no, they are not. Facial expressions, contrary to popular belief, are not universal. They often vary from culture to culture and are highly dependent on the context of a particular situation. Do you get this? Okay, let me give you examples. East and Southeast Asian people often express their embarrassment by smiling or even laughing, while Westerners would keep mum or silent. An impassive blank face, on the other hand, means that they are angry. Other people would probably put on this impassive look when they feel resigned or submissive. Facial expressions are also one of the trickiest parts of human activity. A very recent method, called the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS, has been known to register over 44 basic emotions. And, you see, they haven't even finished counting yet. These basic facial expressions are innate to humans as well. Our facial actions, so to speak, involve a very sensitive combination of movements in the chin, lip, cheek, eye, and brow muscles. And this phenomenon can't be found in the animal kingdom. That is to say, only people have facial expressions, okay? You see, guys, facial expressions are not just repositories of our emotions. They are much more than that. This can be proven just by the mere fact that not all facial expressions are spontaneous. Yeah, you heard that right. Facial expressions are not always spontaneous because sometimes they can be voluntary and calculated, which is why they are called posed facial expressions. The best known illustration of these posed facial expressions would be in Japanese culture. You see, the Japanese have developed a facial masking, which is a method of masking or hiding one's negative emotions with smiles and laughter. Because of this practice, Westerners often think of the Japanese as highly impenetrable or inscrutable.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about. Are any of you familiar with pop art? How about Andy Warhol? Have you ever heard of him? He's the very artist who did those well-known silkscreen images of Hollywood superstar Marilyn Monroe in blindingly colorful combinations. He also did those paintings of the Campbell's soup cans and some cans of Coca-Cola too, or Coke. We're going to talk about that today. I mean, the popular perceptions of Andy Warhol and what is called pop art. First of all, Warhol wasn't the inventor of pop art. He merely popularized it, you see. John McHale was the first artist to ever conceptualize and practice pop art. Warhol may be pop art's most flamboyant character, but he wasn't its founder, okay? He was extremely influenced by McHale, and he combined McHale's beliefs with his love for advertising design, which was his day job. While he was busy working on advertisements for consumer products, he started with drawing shoes, he was also immersing himself in this emerging post-impressionistic art movement started by McHale. Also, despite its seemingly tacky, multicolor images, pop art actually involved itself in serious matters, such as politics or social awareness. So, guys, it's not true that pop artists were completely apolitical or devoid of politics. They actually had a deep involvement in sloganeering against, for instance, the Vietnam War. Brightly colorful posters with screaming anti-war slogans were made in the pop art tradition. In more recent times, pop artists such as sloganeer Barbara Kruger have made works that openly attack abortion, military drafting of youth, and gender bias in the workplace. Lastly, although Warholian pop art portrayed images of commercialism and consumer culture, this should really be looked at as a form of irony. A defining characteristic of pop art is that it refused to take itself seriously. It had this kind of playful sense of humor. So while Warhol's dollar bills and his depictions of Coke bottles may seem like the very embodiment of commercialism and the shallow pursuit of wealth, they are in fact ironic attacks on the values of materialist culture. Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Okay, today we are going to continue our discussion regarding cave paintings. Let's see. One relatively recent discovery was made in 1994 in Chauvet, France. The discovered cave painting turned out to be the most significant and oldest of all. It was dated around 32,000 years ago and showed hundreds of drawings. There were, of course, animals such as panthers, lions, and hyenas. What was puzzling, though, was that it also showed numerous geometric patterns, lines and dots, phallic symbols, and even a figure with the lower body of a human and the upper body of a bison. I mean, it wasn't like any other cave paintings the explorers had seen before. One more thing about the impressive cave paintings was the style in which the paintings were done. In fact, it was so incredible that the progressive theory couldn't be applied here. Why? Because the paintings used techniques not yet seen before. The body proportions were detailed and natural, and the artistic level is comparable to the grand masters of painting. Think about it. Considering this was older than any other discovered cave paintings, historians expected simpler drawings instead of the more elaborate and skilled paintings. And what about the drawings of symbols and signs, which had nothing to do with hunting? Well, the hunting magic theory could not explain what the other figures meant. One theory, made by David Lewis Williams, answers that puzzling question. It claims that the purpose of cave paintings was actually, religious in nature. When shamans, who were the priests during that time, tried to enter the other world, they first had to take in hallucinogenic substances. As a result, they saw visions of the other world. So everything, including the patterns, lines and dots, and figures of half humans and half animals, was drawn by the shamans based on what they have seen in their visions. Well, it turns out that this theory could explain the various non-animal images in the Chauvet Cave and other previous cave paintings.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Astronomers from Harvard University claim that recent discoveries about Pluto and those objects orbiting beyond Neptune show that Pluto should not be classified as a planet. The points they have raised focus on some interesting characteristics of Pluto, among which are its size, type of surface, and mass. Let me tell you something about these. It is inaccurate to say that Pluto is not a planet simply because of its size. This is because of the arbitrariness of the size cutoff that serves as a basis for classifying astronomical bodies as planets. This means that it is not based on solid data, but rather on the preference of some people. As regards to the reasoning that Pluto is smaller than 7 major moons in the solar system, this argument chooses to ignore the fact that Pluto is bigger than the other 40-odd known moons in the solar system. In other words, aside from being arbitrary, classification has also been non-general. It cannot be applied to all cases because it may be changed depending on the particular system where it is applied. Their second point is that Pluto, unlike all the other planets, has an icy surface. There is no particular scientific reason why this characteristic should exclude Pluto from being classified as a planet. There can be 3 kinds of planets: terrestrial, gaseous giants, and finally, icy, right? In a planetary system which formed from a massive cloud of gas and dust, having icy planets is possible. The final point is that the mass of Pluto is not large enough to qualify it as a planet. They say that Pluto's mass is only about 1/5 that of the Moon. Let's look at it from the other end. If Pluto were to be classified as an asteroid, its mass is 10 or more times that of Ceres, the largest known asteroid. So where does this leave Pluto? Again, defining a cutoff in the mass of planets is arbitrary, a question of the preference of some people.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
There are several ways of improving your dental health. The most obvious way, of course, would be to visit your dentist regularly. However, some indirect treatments also exist. The intake of certain minerals or chemicals, consciously or otherwise, can improve your dental health. Well, have you ever heard of water fluoridation? Actually, water fluoridation is one of the controversial ways of treating water chemically. They claim water fluoridation can minimize or even eliminate occurrences of tooth decay, but I would say that that's a little too ambitious. Several countries in Western Europe, for instance, do not practice water fluoridation, but they still experience a decline in the occurrence of tooth decay in their populations. This is because the cause of tooth decay is not fluoride deficiency, as they say. There are a lot more other influential factors known today. I mean, there is no direct evidence saying that lack of fluoride in the body causes tooth decay. And, furthermore, anything excessive is bad for you. Even vitamins, which are generally seen as good for the body, can be toxic if taken in large doses. This is also true for fluoride, right? This is what's ironic about the fluoride levels in fluoridated water. Although current water fluoridation technologies claim to effectively regulate the fluoride levels, they can't control how much water people actually drink. Some people just drink more water than others, right? So, people who drink lots of water, like people in manual labor or construction workers, would also take in more fluoride. It follows, right? They'd be exposed to the dangers of excessive fluoride intake. Also, because fluoride is in the central water systems, everyone is forced to drink fluoridated water, okay? And this is basically forced intake, right? There is an ethical problem here because people should be able to choose whatever chemicals go into their body whenever they want them. Water fluoridation denies them this choice.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Okay, today we're going to talk more about the methods used to control epidemics and the need to fully understand a disease and its modes of transmission before taking any action. To underscore the importance of this, I'm going to use the actions of Europeans in response to the bubonic plague epidemic of the 14th century as an example. Now, the Europeans really had almost no understanding of the plague, and as a result, many of their actions actually exacerbated the epidemic. For example, the Europeans had an incredible fear of the plague. Often a single reported case was enough to spread panic and initiate a mass exodus from an area. I mean, entire towns and villages would literally drop everything and flee in hopes of avoiding the plague. But what they didn't know is that the plague has an incubation period. So in reality, many of the sick fled with the healthy, thereby spreading the disease into new areas. Also, the Europeans incorrectly believed that cats, who had long been associated with bad luck and evil, were responsible for the spread of the disease. As a result, they exterminated millions of cats. Here, the Europeans' ignorance regarding the true mode of transmission for the disease led to counterproductive actions. The bubonic plague was actually spread by fleas, which would pass the plague on to the humans they bit. And the main carriers of fleas in Europe were actually rats, not cats. So by exterminating all the cats in an area, the Europeans actually made that area more susceptible to a plague outbreak.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about. Last week we were talking about the concept of ambidexterity, or the ability of being equally adept in both hands. Today we're going to talk about why, anthropologically speaking, it's not very good to have it. There are a lot of arguments for ambidexterity that sound convincing, but if you consider them more closely, they're actually overgeneralized. Although it may be true that ambidextrous people are better performers, their proficiency is not always up to par. Actually, a good example of this comes from chimpanzees, our closest relatives in the primate family. In a study of chimpanzees and their termite eating patterns, results showed that those who were either right or left-handed ate a third more termites than the ambidextrous ones. One explanation for this was that those who preferred only one hand used it more often, thus becoming more specialized and precise in their task. The ambidextrous ones were not as proficient because they divided their proficiency over two hands. Also, they say that popular ambidextrous figures like Da Vinci and Einstein have proven the benefits of ambidexterity in terms of efficiency. Let me put it this way. These people are rare, very special individuals whose ability we cannot attribute to just their being ambidextrous. They are very good at what they do because of factors other than handedness. Going back to my example of the chimpanzees, efficiency-wise, ambidextrous individuals do not always perform better than the rest. Finally, it is basically flawed to say that ambidextrous people exhibit greater brain size and activity. Why? Okay, the use of both hands may promote brain growth, but academics and anthropologists often fail to mention that ambidextrous people are prone to have various neurological disorders, such as dyslexia and dyscalculia, both of which are widely recognized as serious learning disabilities. Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Much has been said about the 4-day workweek scheme and why it should not be applied. Some may say pushing for this scheme will result in employee strikes and complaints. But contrary to what companies expect, employees do favor a 4-day workweek. After all, there are several attractive benefits to applying this scheme to the workplace. Okay, firstly, there's more free time for the employees. Having a 4-day workweek allows employees to enjoy more quality time with their families and friends. Thus, they have more time to enjoy their life. Because emphasis is now placed on having quality life, instead of putting in more hours at the office, when employees go back to work, they are less stressed and more refreshed. As a result, they are able to focus and concentrate more on their work. And this leads us to the next benefit of a 4-day workweek. When employees are able to focus on their work, their productivity increases. In fact, companies which have already applied this scheme reported a significant increase in overall productivity. Employees are able to deliver more given the shorter time. Let's see. Employees are also able to work on and improve their skills, such as time management, that allow them to deliver great results in only 4 days. Okay, what else? Well, by applying a 4-day workweek, companies are actually able to increase profits. How? The scheme allows businesses to cut down on their expenses. Employees would only be paid for the days they show up. Expenses such as those for electricity and water will also decrease due to less consumption. As for customers complaining about the loss of staff, well, that's not necessarily the case. All the company has to do is to divide the employees into 2 groups. One group takes the day off on Fridays, while the other takes the day off on Mondays. With this arrangement, there is no need to hire more employees.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Okay. Lately, we've been hearing a lot about the supposed benefits of allowing students to leave campus for lunch. Let me take a couple of minutes to explain to you why, under most circumstances at least, this is a horrible idea. Okay, First, most schools aren't located in the midst of a bunch of local restaurants. At best, there might be 3 or 4 restaurants within a reasonable distance of the school. So what happens when you get an entire school going to lunch at 3 or 4 places? It's chaos. Most restaurants simply aren't equipped to handle such a large influx of customers at one time. Another point is that, in terms of student discipline, having kids leave the school is any sane principal's worst nightmare. The potential for trouble is amazing. Some kids may drink or do drugs during their lunch break because there's no longer any supervision. Perhaps more disturbing is the fact that students have no protection from school bullies. In the cafeteria setting, there are always teachers there to monitor the students, so any fights that occur get broken up pretty quickly. In a situation where the students leave the campus, there's basically no one to stop a bully from beating up another kid. Because of these problems, the difficulty of getting served at local restaurants, and the lack of protection, students who go to schools with an off-campus lunch program experience far greater levels of stress than those who simply stay at school for lunch. Thus, students are often less prepared for their studies after lunch than if they simply stayed at school. Another point is that some students, especially those who are bullied outside of school grounds, may become isolated and withdrawn as a result of their torment and the lack of protection.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
Today we're going to try to cut through some of the myths that surround the abolitionist movement of the 1800s. First, we have this idea that the abolitionist movement was this great northern phenomenon, kind of like a mainstay of northern politics and society. It was not. In truth, the abolitionist movement was small, rather disorganized, and never received widespread support in the North. While it's true that the North did see a religious revival at this time, and that this lent some steam to the abolitionist movement, it's also true that this was a time period of rampant racism in the northern states, and most people had no wish to see the slaves freed. As for the abolitionists' wish to create a more equal society, well, that's just pure fantasy for the most part. Some radical abolitionists did call for the equal treatment of freed African Americans, but on the whole, they were just as tainted by racism as other Northerners. Most abolitionists had no desire to live side by side with African Americans. In fact, and you may find this a bit shocking, many abolitionists advocated sending freed slaves back to Africa so that post-slavery America would be an all-white society. Finally, the role of white abolitionists in the Underground Railroad has been overplayed. The purpose of the Underground Railroad was to help escaped slaves get out of the South. Once they were in the North, those escaped slaves were relatively safe. Since most of the abolitionists were based in the North, there was little they could do to help escaped slaves during the most dangerous part of the journey. In reality, it was those African Americans who had purchased their freedom, but who still lived in the South, who played the most important role in the Underground Railroad.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about.
It's true that the average cost of raising children has risen, but this is largely because overparenting is so common these days. What I mean is that a lot of the costs that parents incur in raising their children these days are unnecessary costs. A few examples will show you what I'm talking about. Getting a set of braces for a child is a pretty expensive procedure, so in earlier eras, this was only done if it was medically necessary. But today, the vast majority of kids who get braces do so for basically cosmetic reasons. They don't need to get them, But many parents now think their children need perfect smiles. So, they spend the money on a procedure that, from a medical standpoint at least, is unnecessary. That, by the way, is why insurance doesn't cover those procedures, because they are not medically necessary. The same thing goes for safety equipment for kids. You know, I rode a bike when I was a kid, and my parents didn't buy me a helmet. In fact, I didn't know one kid who wore a helmet in my day. Somehow we all managed to survive into adulthood. Now, I'm not saying that a helmet is totally unnecessary, but a lot of parents do seem to go a bit overboard on safety these days. Okay, finally, the cost of education. The statistics we hear on this are basically a bit inaccurate. It's true that it's possible to spend large sums of money on a child's education. You can pay for tuition at a private school, for private tutors, and many parents do. But again, it's not necessary. Public education is still available free of cost, just as it has always been. Parents just aren't choosing that option. So again, huge education costs are an optional expense.
Now listen to a lecture on the topic you read about. All right, class, I'm sure there are megastores in your neighborhood, right? Well, today we will take a closer look at these giant retailers and see if they are really as beneficial as they claim to be. First of all, as for the convenience of megastores, this only applies if you are looking for common everyday goods. If you are looking for specialty items, you're probably going to be out of luck. In general, megastores don't carry specialty items. What is more, the small specialty shops that do carry those items are often driven out of business by the arrival of a megastore. So, in reality, having a megastore in your town is likely to make your life a lot more inconvenient at times. Next, people are not actually able to save more money by buying goods and products in megastores. You see, it is not true that the prices of goods in megastores are cheaper. If you compare actual prices, most items are actually more expensive there than in drugstores or smaller supermarkets. Some products might be marked down to a lower price, but this is really just an advertising gimmick. The megastore knows that once they get you in the store, you are likely to buy other products as well, and those products will not be marked down. Finally, megastores do not necessarily help the local economy. Yes, they do offer employment opportunities, but for the most part, these are in low-paying jobs with little in the way of benefits. Furthermore, small local businesses generally can't compete with megastores and are quickly forced out of business. Now, let's take a look at that. If you purchase a product at a local store, then the money for that product stays in the local economy. But the money from your purchases at a megastore, or at least a large percentage of it, goes to the company headquarters and does not stay in the local economy. Therefore, megastores actually have a negative effect on local economies.
Additional Practice 1.
Much has been made of the potential disaster posed by global warming, but many scientists remain skeptical of the idea, claiming that more evidence is needed. Indeed, many of them are right. Some of the evidence used to support the idea of global warming is questionable, and it's important that we explore these questions before creating a mass panic. Some scientists argue that the recent spike in temperatures is simply one of many relatively harmless warming trends that have occurred for millennia. A study of seabed sediments off the coast of Ireland revealed a 12,000-year-old history of 9 different climate cycles, lasting 1,000 to 1,500 years apiece, during which both warming and cooling took place, with no disastrous consequences. Additionally, history tells us of smaller warming trends within these larger ones, such as the unexpected increase in temperatures that occurred about 1,000 years ago during the Middle Ages. As for melting glaciers, well, the Earth is already 10,000 years into an interglacial period. That is, a period of temperate conditions that occurs within an ice age. The previous interglacial period lasted about 28,000 years, and some geologists say that, to the best of their knowledge, retreating glaciers in relation to temperature are no more severe now than they were at this point in the last interglacial period. And of course, there's the issue of severe weather. This is based on the idea that high concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere correlate with more severe weather patterns. While this idea does represent sound mathematics, no empirical evidence has been found to support it. That doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true, but it does bear further study. In short, evidence tells us that climate shifts are inevitable, and determining whether this particular climate shift will prove to be the catastrophe that most scientists claim simply requires more research.
Additional practice 4.
So, in the past few years, you've probably heard a lot of this term trickle-down economics. What does it mean? Well, first of all, it's a derogatory term for what's actually called supply-side economics. The idea is that tax breaks for the wealthy and for corporations will result in economic growth, which, over time, will trickle down to benefit the middle and lower classes, who will invest their extra earnings in the economy. However, when one particular version of supply-side economics was introduced in the early 1980s, it led to a long series of short recessions that stretched well into the next decade. By the early 1990s, unemployment was at its highest rate in years, and average yearly earnings had dropped by more than 20%. Those left jobless faced longer unemployment, and when they did return to work, they were paid significantly less than before. This led to less consumer spending, jeopardizing the important role of consumers in this proposed cycle of economic growth, and the economy suffered greatly from it. And these major corporations that had benefited from the tax cuts, well, they still weren't paying their taxes, depriving the government of billions in tax revenue that, frankly, could have been quite useful around this time. Facing a difficult recession, the safety of offshore tax havens was more appealing than ever. Additionally, the gap between the upper and lower classes had slowly been widening since the early 1980s, and with the recession, that gap very quickly became a chasm. Apparently, the tax breaks given to the rich and industrious had failed to trickle down as expected. The rich had either squandered their company's profits or padded their own pockets with the extra money, and the lower class suffered more than ever.
Writing focus. Exercise. Listen to the lecture. How many of you here watch television? I'm sure everybody watches television, and some of you actually watch it a lot. Well, is TV addiction really as bad as they say it is? They probably could say so in television's earlier stages of existence. But now, with the various improvements made on the medium, I mean TV, it's really not that bad. I'm going to tell you why. First of all, they say that TV produces antisocial or maladjusted people. But I would say that TV is a great social tool. It actually brings families together, and watching TV has now become a family activity. You know, some families shop together or go to church together, while other families choose to get together in front of the TV set. TV actually eliminates the borders between family members. It could also be a good socialization tool among friends. For instance, they can meet on a weekend and root for their favorite team in a ball game. So to speak, it's easy to bond when you have TV. Some people say that TV makes children lose interest in more worthwhile activities like reading or even studying. Let's look at it in a different way. Due to recent improvements in the quality of television content, children can actually use TV as an educational aid. Cable channels like the National Geographic or Discovery Channel actually make studying more interesting for kids. Also, studies show that for younger generations, TV is where they first learn how to read. They actually encounter the alphabet first from TV monitors. Lastly, they say that TV affects a person's attitude towards life, and people get to lose their zest for life. Well, TV, like the more serious art forms, is a reflection of life, be it a fictional drama series, news, or game shows. Therefore, someone who watches TV a lot is someone who truly enjoys life.